An alien spaceship originating from the Hercules cluster just descended on planet Earth. We've dispatched our best and brightest to meet them as they disembark their vessel. But the aliens aren't interested in pleasantries or diplomacy or anything like that. They're not even here to wipe us out. Instead, they're after just one thing. Through their surveillance, they've become fascinated by this thing that we call video games. And for some reason, they've latched onto the Sega 32X. Now we quickly explain to the aliens that the 32X is actually just an add-on system with one of the more questionable ports of Doom. It's certainly not even close to being one of our best consoles. The aliens rethink things for a tense moment and then double down on their curiosity. And in the end, they have just one request of us. They want us to give them the video game console that we as Earthlings consider to be our very best. In this video, I use a weighted decision matrix to rank video game consoles across 6 rounds of criteria to identify the console that the people of Earth would present to our alien visitors. We all have our opinions, but I'm going to try and set out to do the most objective analysis of game systems that is humanly possible. After all, the aliens will know if we lied. It's human nature that if you ask somebody to identify the best video game console of all time, their first instinct will be to tell you their favorite, the one that means the most to them. At least that's what I would do right off the bat. I would immediately think of the Dreamcast and start to justify why it must be the best console ever made. How can I convince people? In fact, just type the name of any game console into Google, along with the words best console ever, and you'll inevitably get a number of articles and forum postings claiming that System X is the best of all time. There's no shortage of this stuff. Well, unless you type in the aforementioned 32X or something like the CDI, then you might have issues. But still, by and large, you can find somebody that has argued System X, Y, or Z is the best of all time. But if we are asked by some alien being to represent all of humanity in identifying the greatest console ever, then we need to actually come up with some criteria and at least attempt to be both transparent and objective in our selections. I mean, what if they look into it and find out that we didn't do that? What would the aliens do to us? This is where a weighted decision matrix comes into play. A weighted decision matrix is a powerful but incredibly simple tool commonly used to make decisions in the public policy world. And the reason it's used in that world is that it begins to move the conversation away from being completely subjective in nature and towards some measure of objectivity. At the very least, it introduces transparency. It's been used to tackle a variety of public problems, like selecting the best way to generate transportation funding in a state, or picking among policies to reduce prison overcrowding. And now we can add alien video game requests to that list. Pretty cool, right? Now before we get into the decision matrix mechanics, let me just quickly give you the parameters of this analysis. In determining the greatest system of all time, I'm limiting this analysis to 18 systems that were released between 1977 and 2006. So the current generation, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Wii U, and the Switch are all out of bounds. There's just too much uncertainty there right now, and we can always redo this analysis 10 years from now to see how they held up. And one more thing here. I know some of you might be wondering, where is the CDI? Well, with this analysis, I wanted to make the bottom of the rankings as interesting as the top of the rankings. And if I included the CDI as the 19th system in this analysis, well, you just kind of know it's going to be 19. And I want to make things more interesting than that. Back to the weighted decision matrix. So first things first, what the heck is this? What am I talking about? I'm going to quickly walk through the basics so that you'll feel comfortable with my analysis, and also you'll be able to use it on your own projects going forward. It's really flexible, and you can use it for any number of decisions, both personal and professional. Hell, I even know at least 2 people that have used this to decide if they should get married or not. So there are 3 components of this thing. The first is the options that you're going to be choosing from. In this case, the 18 video game systems. The second is the criteria that you are going to use to judge the options, and I'll get to those in a moment. And the third component is the weights that you assign to each criteria. They answer the question, what is the most important criteria to judge something by? For example, in the public policy world, cost effectiveness might be ranked as more important than, say, fairness. And if this sounds confusing, I promise it will become crystal clear as we move through the analysis. So second things second. In order to construct this model, I needed to decide on the criteria that would be used to select mankind's best game console. Now, of course, if this was for real, I would be sitting around a big table with other people jointly deciding on the criteria. Actually, come to think of it, I wouldn't even be involved, but other people would be doing that. But I'm working alone here, so it's just me for now. So in the end, using the dictionary definition of best as my guide, I settled on 6 criteria that I believe give a good basis to evaluate our collection of video game consoles. Criterion number 1 is going to be a measure of total popularity, as measured by total worldwide system sales. The weight of this criterion will be 0.2. Note that the weights are all going to be decimal numbers less than 1, and in totality they will add up to 1. So another way to interpret the 0.2 weight of this category is to think of it as making up 20% of the overall importance of the ranking system. And clearly you can see that the assigning of criteria weights is probably the most subjective part of this analysis, but the nature of showing the weights is inherently transparent. Nothing is being hidden from view. Criterion 2 is intensity of popularity. You'll see how that's important in removing some of the issues with our first criterion. Now this will also be weighted at 0.2. Next up is the volume of games on each system. I'm not going to assign much weight to this at 0.1, but variety is the spice of life after all. Criterion 4 is critical fanfare. Are those games actually worth a damn? Since quality is probably more important than quantity, I've weighted this at 0.35. Next, we have marginal power, as in how much of a power leap did the console introduce relative to the system or systems that came immediately before. This will be weighted at just 0.05. I don't want to put too much stock in this. And finally, criterion 6 will be uniqueness. How unique was this system? Was it a trailblazer or just another close iteration of something that had come before? I've weighted this at 0.1. So again, if you add all of these weights up, you get to a total of 1. So these criteria are the lenses through which we will look at the 18 systems. And these 18 systems will be judged on a 1 to 5 point scale from very weak to very strong as to how well they perform on each of their criteria. We'll take those scores and do some multiplication according to the weights, and we're going to come out with some numbers. It's going to be great. You'll see how it all unfolds. The first criterion in my analysis has to be popularity, as measured by total worldwide unit sales. It just has to be. And I know some of you might not like this criterion. I don't particularly like using it, but it represents the number of people on Earth that actually voted for a specific system with their wallets. It has an objective nature to it that's hard to deny. Many of you probably already know where this particular criteria is going, so let's just cut to the chase and look at the sales. As many times as you see it, it never seems to lose its shock value. The PlayStation 2 sold an absolute ton of systems. But before you panic, or maybe rejoice, that the PlayStation 2 is going to completely annihilate the competition, don't, because the scoring doesn't quite work like that, as you'll see in a moment. Still, selling over 155 million consoles is damn impressive. Only 2 other systems are even in the 100 million club, the Wii and the original PlayStation. Now I absolutely realize that some will take issue with these numbers by rightfully pointing out that the PlayStation 2 likely sold more consoles because it was commonly purchased as a DVD player in addition to being a game console. However, disentangling the number of people that bought it due to that DVD functionality is nearly impossible. I tried to find some estimates online, but nobody's really done a great job of that analysis. Looking at the Dreamcast on here, I just wish it would have sold a few more thousand consoles to put it above the Saturn in the history books. There's something a little cruel about that final tally, given that so many people do lay the blame for the Dreamcast's demise firmly at the feet of how Sega handled the Saturn. So now that we've seen the sales numbers, how do we proceed with the scoring? And I'm going to run through the scoring process just one time so that you can see how the math works, so that you can follow along at home and maybe apply this, like I said, to some other area of your life. First, recall our scale from 1 to 5, which is very weak to very strong. Now look at the sales numbers again. Based on how this distribution of sales roughly breaks down, I'm going to score each system as follows. Systems with sales over 100 million are going to be awarded a 5 for very strong in this category. And it could be argued that the PlayStation 2 should be the only system to get a 5, but given the DVD issues I just mentioned, I'm much more comfortable with this arrangement. Systems from 49 million to 100 are going to get a 4. Any system under that, but above 20 million gets a 3 for moderate. These guys here get a 2 for weak, unfortunately for the Dreamcast. And the 3DO and the Jag are assigned a 1 for being very weak in this criterion. Now that we've determined the scale score for each system, it's just a simple matter of multiplying that number by the criteria weight to get our weighted scores. Which, remember, in the case of total popularity, the weight for this criterion is 0.2. I'll quickly show you the process for 2 of these consoles that fall on the extreme ends of the sales spectrum. So the PlayStation 2, remember, got a score of 5, very strong in the popularity criterion. So we take the 5 times the weight of 0.2, and that results in a weighted score of 1. Conversely, at the other end of the spectrum, the poor Jaguar scored just a 1 for being very weak in overall sales. Multiplied by the criterion weight gives the Jag a weighted score of 0.2. So these numbers here, the weighted scores, are what matter and what we're going to carry forward as we move through the other criteria. It's these scores that will ultimately be added up to give us a final score and a final ranking for each console. So for round 1 scores, after scoring each console against the total popularity criterion, we have these results. And moving forward, each round will produce results like this, and we'll keep adding the scores up to see the console championship standings as we go. It'll be a bit like following race car drivers as we move through the various stages of a Formula 1 racing season. I'll keep updating the championship standings as we go. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, Sony's systems are all off to a strong start, while some others are already facing a tough task in making up ground. I just hope that the Dreamcast can at least somehow crack the top 10. I think I'll be happy if that happens. And as much as I love the 3DO, I feel like it's going to be in a battle with the Jaguar to get out of the basement. So the second popularity criterion that I'm going to use, intensity of popularity, is total sales divided by the number of years the system was alive. So in other words, it measures average yearly sales. The reason I feel this is a necessary metric to use is that it somewhat minimizes the impediments that may have artificially shortened the life of a given console. I'll give you a couple of examples. Due to issues with Sega's decision making in the mid-90s, it's entirely likely that the lives of the Saturn and the Dreamcast were shorter than they might have otherwise been if not for parent company missteps. This graphic demonstrates what I'm talking about. What we're seeing here is a chronological listing of the lifespans of each of the 18 systems plotted on a timeline. Note the Dreamcast right there, with the shortest life of any system, even shorter than the Jaguar. And I can say that a million times and still be shocked by the words coming out of my mouth. The fact that the Dreamcast was on store shelves for less time than the Jaguar, in my mind, totally justifies the inclusion of this metric. And who knows, there may be other systems that had artificially short lifespans due to parent company mismanagement. Let's look at how average sales per year stack up. So here we see the averages, but that doesn't do us much good in isolation, so let's compare these average sales numbers to the chart with straight up total sales. Now we see that it's interesting that the Wii had the third most overall sales, but had the highest average sales per year, high intensity of popularity. The Atari 2600 had the 10th most overall sales, but when we look at average sales, we see that it slips to 13th. Now this makes sense to me because Atari really left that system on store shelves for a long time, past its expiration date, trying to wring out every penny of value. If you're old enough, you might remember the 2600 Junior model, the ultra cheap model that they pushed out nearly 10 years after the original. That was actually my first game system as a little kid. And my theory with Sega looks to be partly justified, in that the Dreamcast had the 16th highest overall sales, but yet placed in the top 10 of average sales per year. And of course, the trio of Sony systems still do incredibly well, no matter how you look at the sales. So given the average year sales, round 2 scores end up shaping up like this. Again, the PlayStation 2 and the Wii take the maximum possible points from this criterion, each adding 1 point to their totals. But the Dreamcast manages to pick up some valuable points as it places in the top 10 of average yearly sales. Let's add these scores to the scores from round 1 and see how the championship standings look so far. Looking at overall console standings so far after 2 rounds, we see that the Wii has managed to move up and tie the PlayStation 2 on point total, while the Atari 2600 drops a few spots down to 12th. The Dreamcast didn't move up any positions, but it did manage to separate from the bottom of the pack on points. And talking about the bottom of the pack, the 3DO and the Jaguar are locked in battle at the bottom of the table. Now aren't you glad I didn't include the CDI? Because this battle here is going to be a lot more interesting, I think. Game volume is a fairly straightforward criterion in that we're going to assign each console a score based on how many total games it has available. I didn't want to give this criterion too much weight, but at the same time, I had to acknowledge that a healthy game selection is a critical component. Because after all, having more games should mean that there's going to be something on that system for everybody. This chart shows the volume of games available in the USA for each system. I'm giving the USA numbers just for simplicity's sake. In reality, once you get over a baseline of 200 or 300 games, does it really matter all that much how many there are? Still, it's pretty damn impressive that the PlayStation 2 had at least 1,700 releases, and its older brother had over 1,400 releases. I challenge you to try and determine the precise number of games released on each of those systems. It's incredibly difficult, and the number seems to fluctuate depending on the source that you look at. The Jaguar, on the other hand, never really got off the ground in terms of game volume. But damn, if they would have had 3 fewer games, there would have been something very poetic about that tally. Here is the breakdown of weighted points for this round. It's easy enough to see that the PlayStation 1, 2, and the Wii all get 0.5 points, the maximum available in this criterion, while the aforementioned Jaguar, along with the TurboGrafx 16, are assigned the lowest possible points, 0.1. Let's add these to our total and see what happens. Once the weighted scores are tallied and added to our running totals, we see that not a whole lot changes. But the top of the table is really starting to solidify as a Sony versus Nintendo affair. But don't go to sleep on the 360. Now the GameCube did lose some ground and slip to the number 10 spot, while the Saturn moves up slightly into 14th, and we finally break the tie at the bottom as the 3DO moves 0.1 points ahead of the Jaguar. Now the question for all Jag fans is this: will the Jag manage to get out of the basement by the end of this analysis? And the question for me is, will the Dreamcast manage to get into the top 10? Things are looking scary at the moment. We're actually going to explore whether or not all those games are worth a damn. And I'm assigning a weight of 0.35 to this, the next biggest besides the combination of the 2 popularity criterion. I collapsed 2 measures of critical fanfare into one to make up this category. The first measure is a really well put together list found on Wikipedia that documents nearly 200 games that are consistently ranked among the best of all time by video game journalists. The games listed on the page are included on at least 4 separate best or greatest games of all time lists from different reliable publications. I checked it all out and it seems very solid. So I looked at the 18 systems in my analysis and factored in the volume of games they each had on that Wikipedia list. The second measure is going to be a little bit more controversial. IGN, a prominent website in the gaming community, created their own top 25 video game consoles of all time list. They had a long preamble about how they did this, but basically they looked at measures of influence, game titles, and lasting impressions. Although I didn't see any evidence that they're using a decision matrix like we're doing here. Now just to give you a quick sampling of their ratings, they slotted the Jaguar at 24, the Saturn at 18, the Wii at 10, and they gave the #1 spot to the original Nintendo. Now I did look for other lists from other critics, but they all had some kind of limiting factor that disqualified them from entering my analysis. Now between the two measures here, I gave slightly more credit to the IGN ranking than the Wikipedia list. And please see the video description for more information on this, because the math behind the scenes does get a little bit more complicated. So here are all the systems, along with the number of games they had on the Wikipedia list and their ranking on the IGN list. For example, the original Nintendo had 5 games on that Wikipedia list and ranked #1 on IGN's ranking, so that system is considered very strong in this criterion. An example from the middle, assigned a moderate rating, would be the Dreamcast, with 4 games on the list and ranking 8th on IGN's chart. And for an example on the very weak side, we have the Jag, which has 0 games on the Wikipedia list and ranked 24 on IGN's ranking. So the weighted scores for round 4 look like this, with the Nintendo, PlayStation 2, and Super Nintendo all taking maximum points from this criterion, while the Jag, 3DO, and Master System all unfortunately get minimum points. Again, let's add these scores to our championship table. Looking at the championship standings so far, with everything added up, we see that the Nintendo and Super Nintendo both moved up into the top 3 and are actually tied on points, giving the PlayStation 2 a real run for its money. And take a look at the Xbox 360, quietly jumping up a couple of spots to 5th place and nipping at the heels of the icons. The Wii tumbled dramatically all the way down to 6th place. The Atari 2600 manages to jump back into the top 10, and actually ties on points with a falling PlayStation 3, and the Xbox fell a little in the rankings, allowing the Dreamcast to move up slightly ahead of it. And it's as you were at the bottom of the table, with the 3DO still desperately managing to stay slightly ahead of the Jag. I felt that I needed to introduce some measure of power in this analysis. Now I didn't want to include outright power because clearly that doesn't seem fair, but I did want to include some tip of the hat to acknowledge those systems that made big advancements in power compared to the systems that came directly before them. Now I'll be the first to say I'm not a computer scientist or an engineer, so I'm completely out of my depth here. So I searched high and low for somebody that had tallied the power jumps between systems, and finally found this analysis from Liberty Games. In the analysis, the author lists and compares power advances across 4 different areas that you see here. Now I'm totally trusting that whoever put this together knows a lot more than me. Of these 4, I selected MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, as my reference point in comparing systems because it made sense to me on face value. Here's an example of how I assign points here. Let's go back to 1976-77 and look at the Atari 2600 in relation to that classic Fairchild Channel F. The Fairchild, released in 1976, ran at 0.14 MIPS. And apologies if I'm not even using this terminology correctly. Then the 2600 came out in 1977 and ran at 0.51 MIPS. So that jump, percentage-wise, seems pretty big, at least to a layman like me. So I assigned the 2600 a 4 on the scale for being strong in this area. Now again, when we factor in the weights for this category, remember I only gave it a 0.05. It's not going to add up to a whole lot, but at least it's a tip of the hat. Here is the complete list of scores for round 5. The 3DO, PlayStation 2, TurboGrafx 16, and 360 all take the maximum points available in this area. This scoring made sense to me because if you were around during the mid-90s, you probably remember that the 3DO, while ultimately a failure, was a very big jump from the consoles that had come before. The GameCube, Saturn, and Wii all get the minimum points available in this criterion. They didn't advance power much, at least not measured by MIPS. So let's add these weighted scores to our running total and look at the current championship standings. Predictably, not much changed this round, but what did change was big. The PlayStation 1 overtakes the Super Nintendo and ties with the original Nintendo, while the 360 holds firm in 5th, and the TurboGrafx 16 closes the gap with the Saturn and ties with it on points. And down at the bottom of the table, the 3DO creates a little bit more separation between itself and the Jag. This last criterion is here to account for and give credit to those systems that were somehow different from the competition and unique in their own special ways. And strangely enough, it's probably the most subjective of all of my criteria, in that, for the most part, I had to go with my own estimations. Now, I did consult a few key industry books to get some other opinions and information, but actual lists or rankings of unique systems are nearly non-existent. And if you do look for such lists online, you just end up seeing things like the CDI, systems that are just uniquely bad. But still, I felt it was important to include it nonetheless. And of course you can disagree with me, but I believe that the 3DO, the Dreamcast, and the 2600 were the most unique systems of their time, and therefore deserve maximum points in this criterion. The 2600 I don't think I need to say much to justify. And the 3DO was one of those rare systems where you just looked at it, you played it, and you immediately felt, hey, this thing is different. All due respect to the Sega CD, TurboGrafx CD, and minimal respect to the CDI, but this was a full-blown, standalone, CD-based multimedia system that was truly unique and special. You felt like you had entered the future. And the Dreamcast? It earns a 5 for being very strong in this category, just for the stuff that it was doing online before anybody else, at least on console. And not only tried, but actually did do. At one point, SegaNet, the company's online ecosystem, had over 1.5 million Dreamcasts registered online. On the other end of this scale, I'm going to say that the PlayStation 3, the 360, and the Super Nintendo are all somewhat on the low end for uniqueness. I'm not taking anything away from these systems, but I just feel that they're more slight iterations of what had just come before. And it might seem like I'm being overly harsh, but really the weight of this criterion is so small that it's not going to move mountains. So the round 6 scores end up looking like this, with the 3DO, 2600, and Dreamcast taking the maximum points and each adding 0.5 points to their tally. So let's add the weighted scores to our running total and look at the current championship standing. Wait a minute, this is the end. If I show you that, then you're going to see the end result. And I want things to be a little bit more dramatic than that. So let's take a deep breath for a moment. The aliens have returned and they want their answer. Which system do we Earthlings rank as the very best? Now recall our initial graphic. It's time to clean this up, reorganize everything, and see how everything shakes out now that we've factored in all the criteria against all of the weights and added everything together in our table. In the end, 3DO fans can rejoice as the 3DO does indeed finish ahead of the Jag by a somewhat comfortable margin, and we'll see those final point tallies in a moment. Now moving on, the Dreamcast does get into the top 10. Kind of. It actually ends up in a tie for 10th with the PlayStation 3, and with both of those systems finishing just 0.05 points behind the Nintendo 64 in 9th. Talk about close. And believe me, I thought about manipulating something to change that, but that would be completely against the spirit of what I'm trying to do here. Now moving into the top 8 and continuing with ties, the 2600 and the Genesis also end up in a tie with 3.4 points apiece. Can we just consider the 2600 ahead by way of alphabetical ordering? That feels right given the 2600's contribution to the industry. Despite a strong start out of the gate, the Wii finished at number 6, with the 360 finishing number 5. Well earned. The PlayStation 1 managed to beat out the Super Nintendo for the number 3 spot, but the original Nintendo managed to overtake the PlayStation 1 at the last possible moment to finish in 2nd place. It actually pains me a little bit to beat another list that ranks the PlayStation 2 at the top of the pile. It's not that I dislike the PlayStation 2, but there are other systems that I much prefer. But I have absolutely no choice. I've laid out my criteria and relative importance of each, and the numbers are what they are. Here is the final championship table where you can see those final point totals. You can see just how close some of this stuff ended up being. As I said, the 3DO did finish above the Jag by a comfortable margin in the end of 0.45 points, and actually wound up just 0.05 points behind the Master System. So for anybody saying that the 3DO is the worst system of all time, I don't believe you can actually say that, especially given that I did do a rough estimate for the CDI in the end that put that system at about 0.9 points. Meanwhile, and notably, the TurboGrafx 16 finished tied with the Saturn at 2.15 points apiece. And the reason that's noteworthy to me is that I almost didn't include that system in this analysis. What a mistake that would have been. I couldn't have justified that. Then there's the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 3 tied at 3.05 points apiece. Just 0.05 points behind the 64. Damn it. And there's that other tie between the 2600 and the Genesis. It's a bit stunning how many ties there are in this thing, but I'm happy to see the 2600 finish so solidly in the top 10. I think Microsoft fans will be happy with the 360 finishing solidly in 5th, and the Nintendo did make that late surge to finish just 0.1 points ahead of the PlayStation 1. And the Panasonic M2 is so clearly ahead of all other... Wait a minute, sorry about that. I got pulled into an alternate dimension for a moment. There we go. So it's the PlayStation 2 that is so clearly separated from everything else. No risk of a tie there. That's the system that we have to hand over to the aliens. Although let's try and get them hooked on some role-playing games or maybe some racing games instead of the Grand Theft Auto series. I love GTA as much as the next person, but I'm not sure I want that particular series to represent Earth. I hope you found this analysis interesting, and maybe it'll help you win an argument or two down the road. The format of my channel is to release a brief snapshot statistics video regularly, and to release a more in-depth video, like the one you just saw, as often as I can. So please like and subscribe if you find this sort of thing interesting, and until next time, all the best and the sky's the limit.